Welcome to the Real Estate Diaries, where we dive deep into the operational realities of Canadian real estate. Today, we're doing something different, a comprehensive deep dive into tenant background checks across Canada. This isn't just a surface-level discussion. We're going to walk through everything you need to know to implement professional-grade screening that protects your investment while staying legally compliant.
And we need to start with the stakes here because they're massive. One poor tenant screening decision can cost Canadian landlords upwards of $15,000 in damages, lost rent, and legal fees. Yet despite these stakes, many property owners are still approaching tenant screening with outdated methods, incomplete processes, or worse, winging it entirely.
The reality is straightforward. Thorough tenant background checks aren't just good practice. They're your first line of defense against costly mistakes that can derail your property investment returns and consume months of your time in disputes, repairs, and re-leasing efforts.
As Canada's rental market continues to tighten and regulatory requirements become more complex, professional tenant screening has evolved from optional due diligence to essential business practice. Whether you're managing a single property or overseeing a growing portfolio, understanding how to conduct comprehensive, legally compliant background checks protects both your investment and your peace of mind.
Let's start with the legal framework, because this is where many landlords get into trouble. In Canada, tenant screening operates within a complex legal structure where federal human rights legislation intersects with provincial residential tenancy laws.
Right, so while the Canadian Human Rights Act provides overarching protection against discrimination, each province maintains its own residential tenancy legislation that governs landlord-tenant relationships, including screening procedures. This dual structure means that while certain discrimination protections apply nationwide, specific screening procedures, required documentation, and permissible practices can vary significantly between provinces.
For property managers operating across multiple jurisdictions, this complexity requires careful attention to local requirements. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and federal human rights legislation establish fundamental principles that no provincial law can override. However, provinces have considerable latitude in defining their specific screening processes, required notices, and procedural requirements.
Now let's talk about human rights considerations because this is critical. Canadian human rights legislation prohibits discrimination in housing based on protected grounds, which typically include race, color, ancestry, or ethnic origin, religion or creed age, with some exceptions for seniors housing, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or gender expression, marital or family status, disability or perceived disability, national or ethnic origin, and source of income in most provinces.
That source of income protection is particularly important for landlords to understand. In most Canadian provinces, you cannot refuse a tenant simply because their income comes from government assistance, disability benefits, or other lawful sources. This doesn't mean you can't apply consistent income to rent ratios, but you must apply them equally regardless of income source.
So what questions and practices are prohibited? You cannot ask about pregnancy or family planning intentions, inquire about disabilities not directly related to tenancy requirements, request information about immigration status beyond legal right to rent, discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity, or apply different screening criteria based on protected characteristics.
But there are permissible screening criteria: financial capacity to pay rent, rental history and references, employment stability and income verification, credit history and financial responsibility, and criminal background checks, though with limitations in some provinces.
Privacy legislation across Canada requires explicit consent before collecting, using, or disclosing personal information during tenant screening. This consent must be informed. Tenants must understand what information you're collecting and why. It must be specific. Consent should be obtained for each type of check, whether credit, criminal, or employment. It must be voluntary. While you can make screening mandatory for tenancy, consent cannot be coerced. And it must be current. Consent has limits and may need renewal for extended screening processes.
Provincial privacy laws, such as Alberta's Personal Information Protection Act or British Columbia's Personal Information Protection Act, may impose additional requirements on how you collect, store, and dispose of personal information gathered during screening. Let's pause here for a word from our sponsor. This episode of the Real Estate Diaries is sponsored by PropCare, because behind every real estate success story is a hidden operational load most people never see. PropCare was built to remove that load. It's a voice-first property operations platform that answers calls, coordinates trades, documents interactions, tracks expenses, and keeps builders, landlords, and property managers compliant without adding staff or complexity. You can learn more about how PropCare works at propcare.ca.
Now let's dive into the essential components of a tenant background check. Credit history forms the cornerstone of financial screening, providing insight into a potential tenant's financial responsibility and ability to meet payment obligations. In Canada, credit information is maintained by two major bureaus, Equifax and TransUnion.
Credit score ranges are crucial to understand. 800 to 900 is excellent credit with minimal risk. 720 to 799 is very good credit with low risk. 650 to 719 is good credit with acceptable risk. 550 to 649 is fair credit with higher risk that requires additional scrutiny. Below 550 is poor credit with significant risk.
However, credit scores alone don't tell the complete story. A tenant with a moderate score but stable payment history may be preferable to one with a higher score, but recent delinquencies or inconsistent payment patterns.
The critical credit report elements you need to evaluate include payment history and patterns, current debt levels and utilization, length of credit history, types of credit accounts, recent credit inquiries, and public records like bankruptcies, judgments, or liens.
For new Canadians or younger applicants with limited credit history, consider alternative indicators such as banking history, utility payment records, or employment stability. Some newcomers may have excellent financial habits but limited Canadian credit history.
Employment and income verification is fundamental. Stable employment and sufficient income are essential to successful tenancies. The standard guideline suggests gross monthly income should be at least 3 times the monthly rent, though some markets or property types may require higher ratios.
For income verification documentation, you want recent pay stubs, typically the last 2 to 3 months, an employment letter confirming position, salary, and employment duration, tax returns or notice of assessment for self-employed applicants, bank statements showing consistent deposits, and government benefit statements if applicable.
Employment stability indicators include length of current employment, industry stability and employer reputation, career progression and income growth, contract versus permanent employment status, and probationary period considerations.
For self-employed applicants, additional scrutiny is warranted. Request business registration documents, client contracts, or professional references. Accountant-prepared financial statements can provide additional credibility for significant income claims.
Rental history and references. Past rental behavior is often the best predictor of future tenancy success. A thorough rental history review can reveal patterns that credit reports might miss.
For rental reference verification, you want contact information for previous landlords. Ideally, the last 2 to 3 landlords, lease compliance history, property care and maintenance records, timeliness of rent payments, reason for leaving previous rentals, and any damages or disputes.
When contacting previous landlords, ask specific questions about rent payment punctuality, property care, noise complaints, unauthorized occupants, or lease violations. Be aware that some landlords may provide overly positive references simply to facilitate a difficult tenant's departure.
Red flags in rental history include frequent moves without clear explanations, eviction history or broken leases, inability to provide landlord contact information, vague or evasive responses about previous tenancies, and consistent pattern of disputes with landlords.
Criminal background checks require careful navigation of legal requirements and limitations. Not all provinces permit criminal background checks for residential tenancies, and where permitted, limitations often apply.
Here's the provincial breakdown. Ontario. Criminal background checks are generally not permitted for residential tenancies. British Columbia, limited circumstances may permit criminal background checks. Alberta, criminal background checks may be permissible with proper consent. Quebec, generally not permitted for residential tenancies.
Where criminal background checks are permissible, consider whether the information is relevant to tenancy. A decade-old conviction for unrelated offenses may have little bearing on tenancy suitability, while recent convictions for property damage or fraud may be more relevant.
Always consult current provincial legislation or legal counsel before conducting criminal background checks, as requirements and limitations change frequently.
Identity verification requirements protect against fraud while ensuring you're dealing with legitimate applicants. Standard identification verification includes government-issued photo ID, like driver's license, passport, or provincial ID, social insurance number with appropriate privacy protections, and proof of legal right to rent in Canada.
Supporting documentation should include utility bills or bank statements confirming current address, employment authorization documents for temporary residents, and immigration documents where relevant to legal right to rent.
Now let's walk through the step-by-step tenant screening process. It begins with pre-application, setting clear criteria. Successful tenant screening begins before you meet potential tenants. Establishing clear, consistent, and legally compliant criteria protects you from discrimination claims while ensuring you attract qualified applicants.
You need to develop written screening criteria, including minimum income requirements, typically 3 times monthly rent, credit score thresholds, employment stability requirements, rental history standards, maximum occupancy guidelines, and pet policies and restrictions.
Create standardized documentation, rental application form, consent forms for credit and reference checks, information about screening process and timelines, clear explanation of screening criteria, and fee structure for application processing.
Document everything and apply criteria consistently across all applicants. This consistency demonstrates fair treatment and protects against discrimination allegations.
For application collection and review, a comprehensive rental application should collect all information needed for thorough screening while remaining legally compliant.
Essential application components include personal information, name, contact details, identification, employment history, and current income, rental history and references, emergency contacts, vehicle and pet information, banking information, and consent for background checks.
The application review process starts with an initial completeness check to ensure all required fields are completed, basic qualification review to verify applicant meets minimum criteria, documentation verification to confirm all required documents are provided, and priority ranking if multiple qualified applicants exist with clear ranking criteria.
Consider implementing a first-come, first-served policy for qualified applicants, or establish clear ranking criteria that you apply consistently.
For conducting credit and background checks, once you have proper consent, begin formal screening through appropriate channels. Professional screening services can streamline this process while ensuring compliance with privacy and credit reporting regulations.
The credit check process involves obtaining written consent with clear terms, submitting requests to credit bureau or screening service, reviewing credit report thoroughly, documenting findings and decision rationale, and retaining records according to privacy requirements.
Employment verification includes contacting employers directly using official phone numbers, verifying employment status, position, and salary, confirming employment duration and stability, and asking about performance and reliability if permitted.
Timeline considerations. Most screening can be completed within 24 to 48 hours with professional services. However, reference checks and employment verification may take longer if contacts are unavailable. Set clear expectations with applicants about screening timelines.
Now let's break down provincial screening requirements. Ontario's Residential Tenancies Act has specific limitations on landlord screening practices.
Key Ontario screening limitations include that criminal background checks are generally prohibited for residential tenancies, credit checks require written consent and must be relevant to tenancy, application fees are limited to actual costs of credit checks and other screening, and income requirements must be applied consistently and reasonably.
Ontario Human Rights Code considerations include that source of income is a protected ground, you cannot discriminate against recipients of social assistance, family status protection includes single parents and larger families, and you must accommodate disabilities unless it creates undue hardship.
Required documentation in Ontario includes valid government-issued photo identification, proof of income through employment letter or pay stubs, banking information for rent payment setup, and references from previous landlords where available.
British Columbia's Residential Tenancy Act provides framework for screening while protecting tenant rights through the BC Human Rights Code.
BC screening permissions include credit checks permitted with written consent, employment and income verification as standard practice, rental history and references encouraged, and criminal background checks limited to specific circumstances.
Key BC requirements include application deposits limited to actual screening costs, cannot charge application fees beyond reasonable screening costs, must return deposits if application not processed, and clear timeline requirements for processing applications.
Alberta's Residential Tenancies Act provides landlords with broader screening latitude while maintaining essential tenant protections.
Alberta screening practices include comprehensive credit checks as standard practice, criminal background checks may be permissible with consent, income verification and employment checks routine, and previous landlord references expected.
Quebec operates under the Civil Code and Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, creating a unique legal framework for tenant screening. Quebec screening limitations include credit checks require explicit consent and clear purpose, criminal background checks generally not permitted, personal information collection strictly regulated, and language requirements may apply to screening materials.
Now let's dive deep into credit check requirements and processes. Obtaining tenant consent for credit checks. Proper consent forms the legal foundation for credit checks in Canada. Federal and provincial privacy legislation requires that consent be informed, specific, and voluntary.
Elements of valid consent include clear explanation of what information will be accessed, specific purpose for the credit check, tenancy evaluation, identification of who will receive the information, understanding of how information will be used and stored, and knowledge of retention and disposal practices.
Documentation requirements include written consent with physical or electronic signature, date of consent, specific property and application reference, clear identification of consenting party, and witness signature recommended for significant applications.
Working with credit bureaus. Canada's two major credit bureaus provide different services and information formats. Equifax Canada services include individual credit reports and scores, identity verification services, employment and income verification, tenant screening packages, and fraud prevention tools.
TransUnion Canada services include credit reports and monitoring, identity verification, employment verification, rental screening solutions, and risk assessment tools.
Many landlords use third-party screening services that access multiple credit bureaus and provide comprehensive reports. These services often include credit reports from multiple bureaus, employment verification, previous landlord verification, identity confirmation, and integrated reporting platforms.
Understanding credit scores and reports. Canadian credit scores range from 300 to 900, with different ranges indicating various risk levels for landlords.
Credit score interpretation. 800 to 900 is excellent with minimal risk, strong payment history, low debt utilization. 720 to 799 is very good with low risk, consistent payments, manageable debt levels. 650 to 719 is good with acceptable risk, generally reliable, may have minor issues. 550 to 649 is fair with higher risk, some payment problems, requires additional screening. 300 to 549 is poor with significant risk, serious payment issues, consider alternative applicants.
Key credit report sections include payment history, the most important factor showing consistency and reliability, credit utilization, percentage of available credit used, length of credit history. Longer history provides more data, types of credit, mix of credit cards, loans, mortgages, and recent inquiries, which may indicate financial stress if excessive.
Beyond the score, credit reports provide context that scores alone cannot. A moderate score with improving payment patterns may indicate a tenant who has overcome financial difficulties and is now reliable. Conversely, a good score with recent missed payments might suggest emerging financial problems.
Red flags in credit history. Certain credit report elements should trigger additional scrutiny or alternative applicant consideration. Major red flags include recent bankruptcies or consumer proposals, multiple accounts and collections, consistent pattern of late payments, judgments or liens related to unpaid debts, accounts closed by creditors, and excessive credit utilization over 70% of limits.
For new Canadians, alternative scoring approaches are important. New Canadian residents often face challenges in traditional credit screening due to limited Canadian credit history, but alternative approaches can help evaluate these applicants fairly.
Alternative credit indicators include international credit history where accessible, banking history and account management, utility payment records, employment history and stability, educational credentials and professional qualifications, and immigration category and settlement support.
Now let's cover employment and income verification thoroughly. Required documentation. Thorough income verification protects your investment while ensuring applicants can genuinely afford the rent.
Primary employment documentation includes recent pay stubs, last 2 to 3 months minimum, employment letter on company letterhead, direct contact information for employment verification, benefits information if relevant to total compensation, and probationary period details for new employees.
Self-employment documentation includes business registration or incorporation documents, accountant-prepared financial statements, bank statements showing business deposits, client contracts or major account information, professional licenses or certifications, and tax returns both personal and business.
Government assistance documentation includes benefit statements or award letters, direct deposit records, caseworker contact information where appropriate, duration and stability of assistance, and additional support services information.
Verifying pay stubs and tax returns. Document verification requires attention to detail and consistency checks across different information sources.
Pay stub verification elements include employer name matches, employment letter and contact information, gross versus net income calculations make sense, deductions appear reasonable and consistent, pay periods align with stated employment arrangements, recent dates indicate current employment status, and contact employment directly to confirm details.
Now let's talk about reference checks and rental history in detail. Contacting previous landlords. Previous landlord references provide crucial insights into tenant behavior that credit reports and employment verification cannot reveal.
Reference contact best practices include using official contact information, calling during business hours for professional properties, identifying yourself clearly and explaining the reference purpose, confirming the contact person's authority to provide references, taking detailed notes with dates and contact information, and following up on any concerning responses or inconsistencies.
Essential reference questions for tenancy basics. How long was the tenant in your property? What was the monthly rent and how did they typically pay? Did they provide proper notice when leaving? Would you rent to this person again?
For payment history, were rent payments consistently on time? Were there any late payments? If so, how many and when? Did they ever miss payments entirely? How did they handle any payment difficulties?
4. Property care. How did they maintain the property during tenancy? Were there any damages beyond normal wear and tear? Did they report maintenance issues promptly? How did they leave the property when moving out?
For neighbor relations, were there any noise complaints or neighbor issues? Did they respect building rules and community standards? Were there any conflicts with neighbors or other tenants? How did they interact with management and maintenance staff?
Red flags and reference checks. Certain patterns in reference checks should trigger additional scrutiny or reconsideration of applications.
Major red flags include inability to provide current or recent landlord references, references who cannot be reached or verified, conflicting stories between different references, previous landlords who refuse to provide references, evidence of property damage or poor maintenance, history of noise complaints or neighbor conflicts, pattern of lease violations or rule breaking, and eviction history or broken lease agreements.
Now let's discuss background check services and tools. Professional screening companies provide comprehensive solutions that streamline the background check process while ensuring legal compliance and accuracy.
Leading Canadian screening services include Rent Spree Canada with comprehensive credit and background reports, employment and income verification, rental history validation, identity verification services, and online application and screening platform. DIY versus professional services comparison. DIY screening approach. Advantages include lower per application costs, direct control over process, faster turnaround for simple checks, custom screening criteria application, and personal interaction with references.
Professional screening services advantages include comprehensive integrated reports, legal compliance assurance, professional report interpretation, standardized processes and documentation, access to multiple verification sources, and automated workflow management.
Cost analysis and ROI. Understanding screening costs relative to potential losses helps justify appropriate investment levels. Typical screening costs in the Canadian market include basic credit check $15 to $30 per application, comprehensive screening package $50 to $100 per application.
Cost of poor tenant selection includes lost rent averaging 2 to 4 months during eviction process. That's $3,000 to $6,000. Legal costs for eviction proceedings $1,500 to $3,000. Property damage repairs beyond security deposits $2,000 to $8,000. Vacancy costs for releasing expenses and lost income $1,000 to $3,000, plus administrative time and management costs during problem tenancy.
ROI calculation. A $100 screening investment that prevents one problem tenant can save $7,500 to $20,000 in total costs. With typical screening success rates, comprehensive screening pays for itself many times over through problem prevention.
Legal compliance and risk management. Avoiding discriminatory practices. Discrimination in tenant screening creates serious legal and financial risks. Understanding prohibited practices and implementing compliant procedures protects your business while ensuring fair treatment.
Common discrimination scenarios to avoid include source of income discrimination, refusing tenants receiving government assistance, applying different income requirements based on income source, making assumptions about payment reliability based on assistance type, requiring additional documentation only from assistance recipients.
Systemic discrimination prevention requires applying identical screening criteria to all applicants using objective, measurable standards for evaluation, documenting all screening decisions with clear rationale, training all staff involved in screening on discrimination prevention, and regular review of screening practices for bias or discrimination.
Documentation requirements. Proper documentation protects against discrimination claims while demonstrating professional screening practices.
Essential documentation includes written screening criteria applied to all applicants, standardized application forms and processes, consent forms for all background checks conducted, detailed notes from reference checks and verifications, clear rationale for acceptance or rejection decisions, and communication records with all applicants.
Legal consequences of non-compliance. Non-compliance with screening laws creates significant financial and reputational risks. Human rights complaints can result in financial penalties with awards for discrimination reaching $10,000 to $50,000 plus, legal costs for defense, even for unfounded complaints, reputational damage through public decisions, and negative publicity.
Now let's cover special situations and considerations. Screening international students. International students represent a significant rental market segment in Canadian cities, but require specialized screening approaches due to unique circumstances and documentation.
Common challenges include limited or no Canadian credit history, temporary employment authorization, income from foreign sources or family support, different cultural expectations about rental processes, and language barriers in application and screening.
Enhanced documentation requirements include valid study permit and passport, letter of acceptance from recognized Canadian educational institution, proof of tuition payment or funding, international credit history where available, bank statements showing financial resources, guarantor or cosigner arrangements, and family financial support documentation. Remember, effective tenant screening is both an art and a science. While processes and criteria provide structure, experienced judgment in evaluating applications and adapting to unique circumstances makes the difference between good and exceptional tenant selection.
The time and effort invested in comprehensive screening pays dividends throughout the tenancy relationship. Quality tenants who pass thorough screening tend to pay rent on time, care for your property appropriately, follow lease terms, and create positive rental experiences that benefit everyone involved.
Start with the fundamentals we've outlined today, adapt procedures to your specific provincial requirements and property types, and continuously refine your approach based on experience and changing market conditions. Your future self and your property investment returns will thank you for the professional screening foundation you established today.
Thanks for staying with us through this comprehensive deep dive into Canadian tenant background checks. The Real Estate Diaries is sponsored by PropCare, the voice-first property operations platform built in Canada to automate coordination, compliance, and maintenance for builders, landlords, and property managers. If you want your properties to work for you instead of the other way around, visit propcare.ca. New episodes of the Real Estate Diaries drop every Sunday.